people join. But yeah, thank you for coming on. It's always fun to chat. Hopefully we can give the people what they want, which is some actually good content about like some deep content about V4 instead of like some other stuff. So
Sure. Okay, I'll just kick it off then. Hi everyone, welcome to the fourth DeFi Research Hour series hosted by Uniswap Labs. I'm Shin, researcher at Uniswap Labs and co-host of today's conversation. With me here is Austin, my colleague at Labs and co-host for the space as well. Uniswap is the largest marketplace for on-chain digital assets. The tools we create are built on the Uniswap protocol, governed by an independent and decentralized community of Uni token holders. And today, it's the largest decentralized trading protocol. To date, the protocol has serviced over $1.5 trillion of transactions across multiple blockchains and never been hacked, making Uniswap one of the most trusted names in DeFi. Uniswap Labs is focused on building technology that enables users to swap tokens, buy NFTs, provide liquidity, and self-custody their assets with confidence. The opinions expressed during today's conversation will be ours personally and not that of the labs. Our guest today is Dan Robinson. Dan is head of research at Paradigm and co-author on the white papers of Uniswap V2, V3, and V4. Paradigm is a venture capital firm and investor in Uniswap Labs. Dan, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Dan.
All right, first question. When V5 and what's it going to be?
Well, I think I tend to be like not very involved in the last stages of building each of these protocols because I think my Solidity chops are relatively weak compared to the engineering chads over at Uniswap Labs and the foundation. But so I'm generally distracted by thinking about what kind of thing can come next. So I have some possible ideas, but and I don't want to speak specifically to the to whether they'll be V5 or V7 or V some other thing, but I hopefully will have a talk later this summer talking about some of the directions I think Dex Research should go.
Dan, you're underselling yourself a little bit here. I saw your GitHub commits in the core GitHub's repo. So
yeah, my commit profile is the researcher, where if you look at like the Uniswap repo, it's like a huge spike at the early stage of V2, and then nothing, and then a huge spike right like the early stages of V3, and then nothing for months and months, for like a year. Yeah,
I just saw you. I was like, I saw you had more commits than me, and I was like, dang, Dan is he's like really doing that a long time ago. So I respect that. So I think we'll jump to the next one, which is so like Uniswap V4 has launched this sort of idea about hooks, which are expandable add-ons to Uniswap V4 and the AMM marketplace. It's like what type of hooks are you most excited about, and like what types are you least excited about?
Yeah, so I wouldn't say I'm not. You don't pick favorites among hooks. I think all hooks are exciting, and I think part of the point of releasing it is to get a lot of innovation going on top of it. And I think partly that's because if there was a hook that was just an obvious every pool should use it, then I think then it would make sense to build that in, right? So always I think there's going to be trade-offs for them, and they're going to make sense for different assets. But I think one of the areas I'm most excited about, certainly with hooks, is trying to reduce the loss versus rebalancing, the losses to arbitrage. And I think hooks provide a lot of ways to build features that might be able to mitigate that.
Yeah, it's fair. I think one of the ideas that people have been chatting a lot about is this MCAMM, which is like sort of one idea of a loss versus rebalancing, reducing AMM. Do you sort of have any thoughts on that? I've seen some early research by other researchers. How do you sort of feel about that, and your thoughts on how that's been going?
Yeah. I think that's a really interesting one. And yeah, so maybe we can start there, because I think it's something that you couldn't have done in a previous in previous versions of the protocol. So the MCAMM family of designs, and I think Alex Herman might have from Gnosis might have been the first one to post about it. But I think there's been a few different proposals in this family. The idea is so backing up with lever or loss versus rebalancing. The concept of lever is that at the beginning of every block, there's this latency arbitrage. There's a possibility that somebody can come in and trade with the AMM and arbitrage it against an external price, like the price on Binance or something. And when they do that, effectively, liquidity providers they realize a loss because it's sort of an opportunity cost. They could have rebalanced at a better price if they were, for example, just trading directly on Binance. Another way to think about it is that the arbitrageur is making just a risk-free profit there by doing, or almost risk-free profit by making that trade, and that their profit must be the liquidity provider's loss in some real sense. And so, loss versus rebalancing is just the sum of, for every block, there's this loss from if you had done the trade at like the new market price, or if you hadn't done the trade at all, this trade at the top of the block. What's the loss as a liquidity provider versus if you had just held it? And one way to think about it actually is if you imagine just impermanent loss, which is how we often used to think about this, but is a confusing metric in a lot of ways. If you think about impermanent loss with just the space of a single block, that's basically the same as the loss versus rebalancing for that block. And then you just add the impermanent loss blockwise, every block, the impermanent loss for each block added together over a period is the loss versus rebalancing, because the losses you could have had, instead of being a liquidity provider by providing in that block and providing this ability to be arbed. So yet another way to think about this loss versus rebalancing is that effectively liquidity providers are providing a free option to block builders or to the arbitrageurs who trade at the top of the block. And so the idea of the MCAMM, and I think it's fairly simple when you think about it, is to charge for that option. It's to say, actually, to charge for the option, you charge ahead of time. You say you have to pay some premium, you have to pay some rent in order to have the right to be the person who trades on this pool. So the idea is, and there's many forms of this, but I think a relatively simple one would be just to have somebody rent the right to be the first trader on a pool, and if they don't trade on that pool, then nobody can. And so in a given block. And so the idea is somebody on a particular pool, somebody bids to pay 0.001 ETH per block or whatever, and then if they get to be the first person to trade on the pool. Now other people could trade on it after them, but they're the ones who get to collect that loss versus rebalancing, that arbitrage right. And so they're effectively paying this rent every block for that option to do that. And so that rent goes to the liquidity providers. So it's a really interesting idea. I think there are some implementation difficulties, but in general, you can see how hooks actually enable it, right? Because a hook the before swap hook can just say, see who is the owner of this particular right as of this particular block, and only allow this pool to be traded on if in this block that owner or manager has already traded on it, the owner of that particular right at that time.
So one follow-up to that design question is, how much do you think hook design should be kind of chain specific or agnostic? Because I feel like in a lot of sense, the optimal design of a hook, maybe especially related to this idea of auctioning off a right to interact with the pool, kind of the more frequently you do it, the higher the gas overhead there is, and then the more kind of inefficiency that you introduce into the pool that's ultimately maybe transferred onto the swappers who's paying, or maybe the LPs. Yep. And then across different chains, there's obviously different gas fees. So there's different costs of running these on-chain auctions. Do you think it's just a simple reparameterization across chains, or does it actually leads to completely different optimal design, if there is any?
Well, so I think you can get past at least the first order gas, what seems like the expensive gas cost of doing an auction every block. or like do an auction in block n for the right to trade first in block n plus one, by having people effectively auction off the right to rent a pool. So the idea is to pay some rent, and then just they're continuously paying this ETH block by block until something else happens, and they are continuously the person, the entity with the right to trade first on that pool. So the idea here is you would bid, and whoever the current high bidder is in rent terms, you bid some amount of ETH, not amount, just to buy the next block, but just per block, and you're going to pay that every single block, going forward until you run out of money. Or someone else bids higher than you. So if someone bids, Alice bids like 0.001 ETH per block, then Alice maybe has this right to be the arbitrager. If Bob bids 0.002 ETH, then Bob now takes that right effectively from her for blocks going forward. I do think there are a lot of meaty questions around how quickly you should allow transfers of ownership of this right. How granular the bids should be, and I think you can get into a lot of details on that. And again, part of the goal of putting this out there is to see if people can iterate on these ideas. But I think functionally, like that lets you basically do an auction as a continuous thing. And if we talk about, I could talk about some other protocols that use this sort of concept. But I'm generally a fan of this. You can get a lot of gas efficiency out of just assuming things are going to go the same in the next block, unless someone does something.
Yeah, it's sort of one of those design spaces where in theory it's very easy, but in practice there's like a million things that can go wrong, and you got to account for all of them. So definitely be interesting to see what users and integrators and the ecosystem does over time to answer these problems. Another problem that was pretty apparent in Uniswap v3 was the Oracle design. It had a lot of protections that were built in from proof of work, and now there's proof of stake. Sort of took those protections away. What do you sort of see? Are you like you did write the blend protocol, which is sort of an anti-Oracle piece, but how do you sort of feel about on-chain oracles in the long term, especially with v4?
Yeah, I mean, I would. No. So I'm not anti-Oracle at all. I think, again, I think it was pushed early on for Uniswap to include an Oracle in v2, in part because I think it's nice to have this as a source of data. And I mean, the alternative was people actually were trying to use Uniswap as a spot. This the spot price on Uniswap as an Oracle, which was a big mistake at the time, and it was very manipulable. I think I think it's sort of an open question, because there's a trade-off with oracles, right, where swappers and functionally in some sense LPs have to pay or bear the burden of the gas cost for updating an oracle, and then oracle users are free riding on that price, on that effort. And I think we decided, at least early on, like when there weren't a lot of on-chain oracles available, sort of decentralized oracles available, and we wanted to experiment with it, that it made sense to basically impose it. And when you had to pick something, it's like V2 had to have an oracle or not have an oracle. And all right, it's worth sort of experimenting with this here. And now we've had 3 years of having on-chain oracles. I think we found some use cases that they make a lot of sense for and that people use them for. But I think it's about time to say, okay, we don't necessarily need to, as a top-down design decision for the entire space and the entire Uniswap protocol, say like you have to subsidize this oracle and make sure people get to use it. And so I think people are working. I know Euler has been working on ways to try to create a more robust oracle built into a DEX. And I think that's, if you want to have an oracle in some sense, maybe you should pay for it. Maybe you should be subsidizing liquidity on that pool. Maybe you should be paying the gas costs. Like, there's ways to use hooks to actually have the oracle users pay in order to refund swappers for the gas that they're spending in order to update the oracle for them, right? So I think there's a lot that hooks will allow you to do that, and you don't necessarily have to make this one choice of we're going to force everybody to do this.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to imply that you were an anti-Oracle. I just mean that I think one of the coolest use cases of the Oracle's design was the blend protocol, which we'll get into a little bit later.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's interesting to see. Well, it'll be interesting to see what users do and how they integrate with V4. Sort of on that line, one of the innovations of V4 that I think is really impactful will be dynamic fees, which we sort of talked about this a little earlier with the MCAMM, but Do you sort of see like dynamic fees any other way that they can be made? And like, do you think that they have like a space for being impactful?
Yeah. So people have been looking for formulas to figure out, all right, what should the ideal fee be, say as a function of volatility, for a while. And I'm not sure there's any magic number for it. I think it depends, like what the right fee is depends on a lot of factors, including just the demand that users have for trading and how they respond to fees, which nobody really knows and doesn't fit into a formula. So but I think in practice we do see that when professional market makers market make on order books, they tend to quote wider spreads for effectively have like higher fees for more volatile pairs. I think there's a lot of theoretical reasons why they do that, but I think I think it does make sense often, and we've seen with Uniswap v3, for example. Typically for less volatile pairs, people there's more liquidity provided in the lower fee, like stablecoin pairs in the lower fee pools. There's more volume to those, whereas in more volatile pairs sometimes there's people will use like the 1% pools. I think there's a lot of room for figuring out how that could be dynamically responsive to volatility in the asset, or how you could do it in a way where it doesn't require liquidity providers to be making that decision or changing it. I think one of the most interesting ways to me, and this is related to the MCAMM, and this is an idea I've talked about with Austin a lot, is to auction off the right not just to be the first trade in a block, but to auction off the right not just to be the first trade in the block, but to set the fee and to receive effectively the fees. And what that does is it makes someone else effectively in charge of maximizing fee revenue, and they're in line with some off-chain, brilliant market making agent that has access to all kinds of other information. Gives them effectively the right incentives to figure out, all right, let me pick the fee that maximizes my revenue because I'll earn all the fees or some percentage of the fees, and then they're paying rent to liquidity providers instead. And there's a lot of uncertainties and imperfections in that design too. And I don't want to get too deep in any of those, but I think it's a very interesting extension of the MCAMM for that.
Yeah, that'll be a conversation we have for many, many months, how to fix all of those little trade-off spaces. I think sort of a last hook that we think is really interesting is based off a paper that you wrote with Dave White and with Hayden about the time-weighted average market maker, or TWAM. Do you sort of see like that being used a lot, and how do you think it sort of benefits users in the long term?
Yeah, so the way TWAM works is it allows users to place these TWAP orders that execute at the Uniswap pool's actual like TWAP price over a particular period. And there's some nice things about TWAP orders. They're a lot harder to sandwich, and you lose a lot of that sort of off-chain math. So they're good for the user often, and that it's easier. Obviously TWAP manipulation is still possible, but especially if they do it over a long period, it's easier for them to potentially get a fair price. But I think another interesting thing about it is that it seems really beneficial to me for the liquidity provider, because this is TWAP liquidity is liquidity that's executing on a TWAP order. Oh, I'm sorry, TWAP volume. This volume that's executing as part of TWAP orders. It isn't aggregatable. It in some sense like can only be executed against by passive liquidity. And like I think that's very cool, and is sort of a unique advantage that gives passive liquidity providers, because I think passive liquidity providers right now are competing with all kinds of off-chain market makers and RFQ providers and people who are other dexes, and like there's potentially a race to the bottom and profits from that. But if somebody's doing a TWAP order on your pool, then actually like you just sort of that only a passive liquidity provider can actually fill that order exactly according to the TWAP price is guaranteed on chain. And I think that's just like vaguely pretty cool.
I agree as well. I think probably the follow-up to that is about what does like V4 not have, essentially. So like, what do you think V4 is missing? And what do you think are like ways, maybe just like what is V4 missing? I think that's probably a big enough question, how it is.
Yeah, well, so I think one category of answers to that question is anything that could be built on a hook but isn't, and I think that's missing by design in V4. And that's anything like oracles, for example, where in general you can build these things. And the intention is to build these with hooks, and so we try to pull out as much as you can from V4, so that it can be added in as hooks. I am especially curious to hear from people what V4 is missing in terms of hooks, because I think I think it's not you can't it's very flexible, the current hook system as designed, but it's not possible to do everything you might want to do. There aren't hooks, for example, every time a tick is crossed, and I think there are gas implementation reasons why that isn't the case. But I would be very curious to hear from people before V4 is set in stone. I'd be curious to hear from people if there are ideas for hooks that it might be missing. I've seen some suggestions about or how hooks might be changed. Because I think there's some things you could do in theory with hooks, but not with the hooks that V4 provides. And I'm curious if there are use cases for those. And then I think there's whole categories of problem that V4 maybe partially solves, but doesn't go doesn't. The sort of problem that may not be easily solved by hooks. And I think like one of the biggest, V4 has a lot of gas optimizations, but obviously it's still expensive to do trades on Ethereum mainnet, and so figuring out ways to reduce the gas cost, the cost that goes to P5059 is I think an important research area that isn't other than the significant gas optimizations isn't really like revolutionized in V4. And I think it's hard to do with hooks.
Yeah, sort of a benefit of building in public, right, is that you can hopefully, if there's any glaring mistakes that we made, so hopefully someone else will point them out and we can go on. So I'll let Shin take sort of the next question.
What do you think we should do about the malicious hooks? As there will be many, I would predict.
So one thing I think is interesting about hooks is there are some hooks that you can provide liquidity on it. So the malicious hooks, the idea here is you could provide to a pool that has some custom behavior that means that they could rug liquidity providers, for example. And I think liquidity providers should be very careful when providing to a pool with hooks that can. One interesting thing is you can there are certain types of hooks that can't actually rug liquidity providers, and like the before swap hook, for example, which is my guess is it may be the most often used hook in general, doesn't actually allow you to prevent liquidity providers from withdrawing their liquidity. There's a lower bound on effectively how much liquidity providers can lose from providing to this pool, and I think that's interesting. I think you can sort of fearlessly provide to a pool that it only uses this, and interestingly the permissions of what a hook is allowed to do, including which hooks is allowed to hook into, is baked into the address of the hook contract. So you can just like look at the contract address and you can tell, okay, this hook can't rug me if I provide liquidity to a pool that uses it, which I think is pretty cool. For hooks, obviously that use there's hooks before and after minting or burning liquidity. Or some other hooks that could allow liquidity providers, could allow the hook contract to rug you. I think you just have to be very careful about the code, and the same kind of thing you would do before trusting your code to any smart contract. Is check if it's audited, read the code yourself, see if you the extent to which you trust the author, all the factors that would normally determine whether you'd be willing to trust your money there. But it's an area where I think you have to be a lot more careful than you do with hooks that don't have those abilities as a liquidity provider. And as a swapper, I think in general, ideally the router contract should actually be protecting you from failed swaps in general. Like there's you can actually guarantee that your transaction does not complete if it doesn't get the amount out that you expected. And so as a swapper, there are a lot of ways to protect yourself just by using a router contract.
Yeah, I think it's malicious hooks will be a very interesting way, and to see how people sort of deal with them will be very interesting to see how the ecosystem sort of grows on that. There's been sort of a conversation on the internet and on Twitter about Uniswap v4 being sort of a rehash of a lot of old designs. Do you sort of think that Uniswap v4 is innovative, or is it just like everyone's ideas all sort of thrown into one?
Well, I mean, I think the point of the hook construction is explicitly inspired by everything that everybody is doing to like build, to like the MCAMM design that Alex had, or the or TWAM, or these other designs. Like the entire point of it is to, and none of the, these are not built into V4. The point of having hooks is to say you can build all these things that other people are building and that we think are really cool on top of Uniswap. As far as whether the architecture itself is similar to others, again, I think like I candidly admit to I thought singletons were interesting from I think Balancer V2 had one, and then I think actually Sushi had Trident, which was sort of a different kind of singleton contract for which never actually ended up launching. But I don't think I think the actual implementation of singletons that we did wasn't from me. It was from Moody, and goes back pretty far. I guess, yeah, I think from my perspective, yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of ideas. I think Ambient was or formerly CrocSwap, I think was very early to the singleton construct as well, and I think it's the right design, and so I think it's like correct that everybody ended up landing on this.
Yeah, it's sort of the thought that I have that people are like, well, these are already things that exist in other protocols. And I was like, it's not the fact that they exist in other protocols, it's the fact that you can make them and sort of do anything that you want, not enshrined in the protocol. But yeah, that's sort of just my thoughts, but I'm a little biased. So I'll let Shin sort of get to the next question.
Yeah, so I guess somewhat a spicy one here, but there's a lot of discussion about whether the license is the right choice and whether it incentivizes the right mentality to contribute. Mainly, people who contribute to the hooks library are obligated to, I think, inherit GPL. Of course, they can do their own like private one, but we do have a template for them to contribute to the core repo. And then I think because we had into the periphery, and then because we have GPL there, then other people needs to have GPL as well. Do you think that's even a contentious point, or is that something to be considered?
Right. I mean, my understanding is I don't think this. I think hooks can have. Am I right that hooks can have any licenses they want, and you can build. There's nothing that stops you from using a hook that. Yeah, right. And building a hook that has whatever license you want, and having a Uniswap v4 hook into it. I think I think what I've seen the most discussion about is the use of the business source license in V4 as it was in V3, and I guess my perspective, I think I understand why I think some people as a result wouldn't want to say like contribute to the core Uniswap code, and I think that's fine. And I think like it's a loss not to have people who would otherwise contribute because it isn't. I think in my view, and it's roughly like it's a decision about what's how you want people to use your code and how you want people to interact with it. And I think again I can only speak for myself personally here. And there's not I don't think this is more widely shared at Uniswap, but certainly speaking for me, I think some of the psychic damage from having seen some of your designs and code that people that you helped with forked and aggressively and angrily used against you, well, I think had something of a profound effect on my feeling that people really just want to like contribute to your code. And, I think like it honestly is not, in my view, that hard to implement a lot of these ideas independently, and it's almost like a bare minimum. Basically, I think that you should have to do if you want to build a dex that aggressively competes with someone. And I think I think it's like I personally sort of didn't enjoy it. The sushi swap vampire attack, and I'd say that's why I like the idea of the BSL.
Yes, I always good to remember the old days and the impacts of previous events, right? I guess on a completely different note, I think we'll sort of go a little bit away from V4. So you alluded earlier to Blend, which is sort of, I think, like the last protocol you worked on before V4, and released it. So I think Blend was pretty interesting because it was sort of like Oracle-less lending innovation. So how do you sort of feel about Blend, the innovations, and sort of like any other thoughts that came out of it on its successes?
Yeah, so Blend is I think a pretty simple design for borrowing against arbitrary collateral, and the key idea of it comes from roughly the kind of peer-to-peer just lending that was pioneered by projects like NFTFi and Backed, which is every instead of having this pooled lending, like sort of like Compound and Aave pioneered, we're gonna run it all back, and we're gonna go actually to just peer to peer. Every loan has one particular every piece of collateral has one particular lender against it, and the idea there is that says the lender could be any sophisticated party off chain. You're making the same kind of assumption that you do in V3 with Uniswap V3 that there are going to be these sophisticated actors off chain that can basically do a lot of optimizations that you might not normally. And I think it's impossible to just build them directly into the protocol. The protocol doesn't have the right signals. It doesn't have doesn't have the efficiency of computation. You're not smart enough to do it. So you just say, okay, we're going to assume someone else is going to do it. They're going to value these NFTs at some price, and they're going to lend against them. And then we figure, okay, how do we actually mitigate some of the downsides that come with that? And I think in previous versions, generally these were Oracle-less protocols, but generally these had been expiring protocols. And so the idea here is there's just a couple clever ways in Blend to roll these loans automatically and to allow liquidations to happen through a kind of refinancing auction. And the net effect is you can basically you get liquidated if and only if nobody in the world would be willing to lend to you at any interest rate against your collateral, the amount that you owe. And I think that's a pretty fair reason to liquidate someone. It's basically like the fairest reason to liquidate somebody for a floating rate anything would be that like literally nobody in the world wants to take this position against you. And so I think it's a fairly simple protocol. I think it's interesting in part because it works for NFTs, but actually it could work for anything. And so it's a way potentially to do long tail lending in general. But I think it has some drawbacks. I think you end up with a lot of different interest rates, for example, and interest rates don't automatically adjust. You have to trigger a liquidation or some kind of refinancing in order to change the interest rate. So I think there are some downsides to the construction. But generally, I think it's just very cool to use crypto economic oracles. I think it is cool just the concept that if someone's willing to pay for this, then that might as well be its price. Or if nobody's willing to pay this for it, then we know we have a lower bound on the price, like or an upper bound on the price. Like I think these are useful things that people maybe have forgotten. And trying to build a Uniswap V2 and V3, the oracles are designed to be like, we're just going to give you one number and that's supposed to be the price, and we try to make it as manipulation resistant as possible. Well, like, what's that really mean? We're in a market that doesn't have like zero spread. It doesn't have like a perfect price at any given time. And so actually what you're looking for often are these lower bounds or these upper bounds, and that's what Blend kind of plays with.
Back to V4. Let's say V4 really took off and we end up with about 1 million pools and 100,000 type of hooks, half of which are malicious in one way or the other. What's the solution to route through them? How do you know what's the best way to go through so you end up with the most outcome?
Yeah, I think it's a really challenging problem. routing. You're talking about routing through just routing through hooks. I think it's through multiple pools. It's related to the problem of routing across DEX liquidity in general, and it's this sort of like nasty non-convex like optimization problem, and it depends on the gas costs and if there are any risks of these particular pools. I think in I have not thought deeply about it. My guess is you're going to find that like really brute force empirical methods may work surprisingly well. I think they just sort of have tended to, and so just like try a bunch of different routes and like tweak them a little bit and see what happens, and do like bisection searches and other kind of nasty stuff. My guess is that could be effective on it. But I think I'm probably behind the state of the art on route optimization in general.
Without specific hooks, and with transient storage, is new pool still non-convex in V4? I think it might be convex, right? If you assume there's no like, a fixed cost of routing through an additional pool.
There is a fixed cost of routing through additional pool, right? Because of there's the gas cost of just interacting with the pool. You got some cost,
just much smaller.
Right, but it's almost zero in.
I don't think it's
V4,
almost zero.
Just much smaller.
Right. But it's much smaller than V3. Okay.
It's meaningfully smaller than V3. I mean, you guys give me the data on it or whatever, but I don't think it's nowhere close to like zero cost effectively. So you're gonna have something similar.
No, yeah, definitely not zero cost, just significantly cheaper. And how that trade-off goes between routing to multiple pools and, like that cost coming down, but if you want to route to more pools and price improvements are going to be a very tricky question, though. But something that people have solved before with like on L2s where it's functionally the same cost of routing to other DEXs. They got to go sort of figure that out.
Wait, actually, so I guess related to that question, would you say that Singleton and all the hype about flash accounting is maybe slightly overrated then? Because on the one hand, it doesn't reduce it to zero. On the other hand, most trades, if I remember correctly, are only just one hop in one pool. So is it really a big deal?
Well, yeah. Well, I think and part of it is the what do you save? You save basically the accounting of the ERC20s for the internal transfers between them, because you don't have to track any kind of internal pool to pool transfer, and you save some calls, and there's probably like a little additional overhead. I'm not sure that you save, but again, yeah, I think it's I think it's you guys tell me exactly on that. I'd be curious for the actual metering numbers on it, but the broader question is it? I mean, I think it's the cost of deploying a new pool is extremely expensive in V3. I think that's part of it. Is the part of the gestalt of Uniswap V4 is about like we want to let 1,000 pools bloom, and you don't really have that if it costs like hundreds of dollars to deploy every new pool, right? And so I think the idea here is reducing the cost of experimentation and of trying a bunch of different ones. Yeah, I think the routing cost is part of that, but the deployment cost is a big part as well.
Yeah, what I learned sort of I was talking to Noah and Poe yesterday, it's really, really hard to get exact numbers because the Solidity compiler doesn't exist yet. So it's like the numbers they had from like a year ago were like really, really hard to get because they had to essentially make the compiler themselves, which is not a trivial task because it's not optimized either. So I think they sort of have an idea, but we don't know if it's exactly correct. And so it'd be interesting to see when routing comes, like how will that, what will those numbers be and how will they shake out? So I think sort of a more fun question is you've really been with Uniswap since the beginning of V1 and sort of also like not been with Uniswap, but like been close to Uniswap since V1. So what is like, do you have any sort of fun stories you could share about maybe the good old days?
Fun stories about Uniswap. Yeah, I mean, let me see. I think let's see. Well, I have some memories of distinctly. So Uniswap, was pretty scrappy up through almost up to like the V3 launch, effectively. was a very small team, and was in this like tiny attic in Brooklyn, and I remember some case where there was a fire in the office that someone had to put out. But I don't remember the details. I don't want to describe it too much. But in general, yeah, I mean, I think the let's see, fun Uniswap stories. I honestly do think, when I talked earlier about the psychic damage from the sushi swap a vampire attack, but that was like, so this was maybe about 6 months into COVID, and everyone had been apart and hadn't really seen each other. But I think, like, it was a really, this was DeFi summer. It was an interesting summer, and then this was kind of like just the capstone to that. Was this really sort of, when when at the time, extraordinarily scary experience, but also when you look at it, sort of extremely based. And like, it's very cool that you actually can do a thing like a vampire attack. And it's sort of, was this larger than life moment where you basically have like this weird sort of like rogue hero slash villain, Nomi, and versus Hayden, sparring on Twitter and competing for liquidity, and like then and Nomi rugging, and then coming, all this sort of like dramatic stuff. And I sort of largely remember those times very fondly, as and I think remember the closest of the Uniswap team during those few months as being really, and I know you've talked to others on the team about it and the way that they get very nostalgic about it. But despite basically everyone being physically apart, felt very much, felt like the team was very close together at the time. I think that was fairly cool, and spurred by this very sort of interesting, extraordinary circumstance.
I think, I don't know if you're in the photo, but we've seen the photos of like those days where the sort of vampire attack was happening, and sort of the whole team just on a little Google Meet call, which is quite funny. Yeah. I think you may be on them. I'm not 100% sure. I just remember Noah and Teo. But yeah, it's sort of it's interesting that like such a fun thing, not a fun thing, but an interesting thing happened out of such a, what was
Kind
probably seen as a dismal moment for the team. I think one of the other questions that we have is about L2s. So I'm somewhat of an L2 maxi myself, and I think that, like, do you think that L2s will pass L1 volume in the next sort of maybe like 5 years, 10 years, some time period that is far enough away that we don't think about it?
In the next 5 years, it seems very likely to me. It would be very strange if it didn't, in some sense. If we're talking like Dex volume, I think that's especially true if you consider that, like right now what we have on these L2s are these very kind of monolithic, like L1 like L2s, where you have to sort of I move from Ethereum mainnet to Optimism mainnet, and then I pop around and interact with it like it's its own chain. I'm in my own universe. I think that makes sense, and we'll have a lot of that. But I think one interesting thing we're starting to see is actually, if you have much more efficient modes of interacting with an L2 and moving back and forth to an L2, you could just interact with an L2 almost like you're interacting with an individual application. You say, like, I'm just going to really easily move my money over to L2, do some stuff on it, and then instantly move back, say, or instantly move to another L2. And if interoperability gets a lot better, then you just have a lot more usage on individual L2s. But I think we might start to rethink what an L2 is, and we start to see things that are more like applications that actually work as a roll-up. Functionally they're roll-ups, but users don't experience them as like, their own platform. They experience them as like, oh, I'm using, Aave or whatever, but actually it's Aave chain or something, and it's an OP stack roll-up, something like that. And I think that model for L2s is really interesting, because an application doesn't have to, like, oh, I'm going to like go deploy on an L2. It's like, I am an L2, and I'm just going to be way cheaper than I would otherwise be. And users can just abstract away from the user where they're doing this.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see, especially as the OP stack and other L2s get more sophisticated, what innovations we'll see and the ease of use that will sort of probably occur from them. So there is a big story within the Uniswap team that you are a karaoke maxi. So we want to know what is in fact your favorite karaoke song. Like if I threw you in front of a stage right now and I was like, do it, Dan. What do you think you're singing?
Yeah, so it used to be Baby One More Time by Britney Spears, which I've done maybe 75 times in my life
Very
in
iconic.
karaoke. And yeah, it's a great song. And I think during COVID, I think my vocal range, I sort of hit puberty, I guess, and like my vocal range, my timbre sort of mellowed
Mm-hmm.
such that it's harder to hit the high notes and really evoke Britney the way that I think she deserves to be evoked. And I think so more often now, I'll still do like Britney as like my opener, but more I've been leaning into My Way by Frank Sinatra, because I think that's where my voice is going a little
Mm-hmm.
a little lower and gravelier. Maybe I don't know if it's COVID or something, but like pre-COVID, I would do karaoke a lot and do Britney all the time, and now I find myself doing Sinatra more.
That may be the most impressive breadth of catalog I've ever heard. Britney to
Turns out they're
Sinatra.
just like yeah. I don't know. They would listen to it. It's weirdly similar.
That's why I've been thinking about mine. The team's like, you're gonna do karaoke, and I've been like, I gotta come up with a karaoke song. So I'll definitely. I don't know about Britney, but we'll definitely be spending my time today trying to figure that out. Maybe sort of I'll let Shin sort of ask the actual real questions instead of questions about karaoke for a little bit.
Okay, some really quick best effort prediction questions. First one, V3 V4 volume ratio 90 days after launch.
That's a really tough one. My guess is 90 days after launch V4 is flipped V3, but I won't make much more of a prediction than that.
Somewhere around 50% is
Somewhere around
I guess
50%,
the best.
maybe. Yeah.
Okay, number two, volume weighted fee rate among V4 pools.
Volume weighted fee rate.
I don't even know what the volume weighted fee rate is.
What's the volume fee
For
rate on
reference,
V3? You could ask
think
these for like
7
V3,
bips.
V2, and V3 or whatever, but I'm gonna give you terrible guesses. So no one should trust my predictions if I don't even know some of these.
I think we know them either. So it's,
I think for V3 it's about 7. Last time I checked.
7. That would be my guess for V4 as well. Then
For V4 as well. Same here. If I were to guess, the third one is percentage of volume running through hooked versus not hooked pools in V4.
pools that have 0 hooks at all in them. I think a majority of volume will go through non-hooked pools. Which would be kind of a bold guess. But I'm getting that from, I think, like, you look at volume on V3 and it's driven by the USDC WETH 5-bit pool, and that is a pool that is not going to have any hooks in its dominant incarnation in V4.
that's a very hot take. I respect that take.
What hook would you put on that pool?
I don't know. I think a lever reducing one might be interesting, but yeah, I think the
Lever, it would be. I don't think we've got a good enough. And to be clear, like all the lever stuff, like
Yeah.
I think very very interesting. Still fairly theoretical. I think it's gonna be hard, just gas wise on Ethereum L1.
Yeah.
To beat the non-hooked pool for that exact use case. But I think you'll have this very long tail of tons of different hooks. And again, for WETH USDC pairs, I think hooks also get more interesting. I think you'll have a major WETH USDC one with some Oracle or other on it.
Yeah. Also, this is like 30 days out, right? So I think as the ecosystem gets more, as we saw with V3, the ecosystem got more and more sophisticated as time goes on. So maybe like 2 years out, I changed my answer. I sort of agree with you. Maybe like 2 years out, it'll be a hook, but maybe at like 30, 90 days out, I probably do agree.
And then number of hooks in the first 30 days.
Number of different hooks deployed. First 30 days. Assuming launched in the fall. Actually, I'm gonna guess like 10. I think there's gonna be something of a slow ramp up.
I will take the upper there, but
that tail's going to be pretty thick, I think. But yeah, it's unclear.
Yeah. I mean, if you count hooks that like someone tries out and like barely uses.
Yeah.
No. Then more. But I think if you count ones that have like meaningful volume on them, yeah, I'd say like 5 to 10. I think a lot of this stuff takes a while. I mean, we put in oracles in V2, and it took almost a year. It was basically until V3 came out that anyone started really making decent use of them, and then V3 totally obsoleted that old model, but like it at least got people starting to work on it. I think integrations take a while, which is one of the reasons I know why Uniswap wanted to open source this earlier on, because it would have taken a very long time, I think, to get hooks up and running if you launch like on day one and announce what they are.
Yeah, people would be a little.
I saw an interesting question coming from the comments and related to this list, which is what's the split between ETH and WETH liquidity in V4?
That I think. Well, I think I think it's not yet decided exactly how V4 should treat ETH and WETH. And like I'm sort of in the camp that it would be cool to have them be fungible in one way or another, where you special case WETH. But so in that case you would, it's like 100% in one. Otherwise, I don't know, man. I mean, geez, I don't know. It's a really good question.
So you're not worried about WETH depegging from WETH at all?
I am not worried about WETH.
Sorry.
For me. No. There are two smart contracts that I would like put my life savings in, like bet my life on, and it's Uniswap V2 and WETH. And any other smart, even Uniswap V3 and V4, I would not trust my life to there's no bugs in that contract. I will, because I've read the source code to Uniswap V2. It's like, all right, this is solid.
Yeah, it's been battle tested many times on many different chains. I guess I'm an ETH maxi. I think that it'll be all ETH, mostly just because of the cost of.
Other dexes use WETH though, and like you're gonna have to unwrap it to do atomic. I think it will. You're probably right. More ETH than WETH.
Yeah, I think it'll be the ETH, like the main ETH USDC pool will be ETH and not WETH. Also, I think wrapping after the swap might be less expensive still. But yeah, I think making them interoperable would be very cool. I think that's probably like the way to do it. But I
mean, we're just gonna have people providing ETH WETH liquidity, which was the strangest thing in Uniswap V1.
I did say that I wanted to figure out the gas cost trade-off where it was optimal to route through my ETH WETH pool and then provide liquidity for that. But I think I'm gonna get rugged of my money making adventures, not financial wise, obviously, but maybe. So I guess I'll go to the last one and we'll wrap it up. You've obviously been a pioneer in the research, sort of like the DeFi research space and sort of the crypto research space in general. How do you sort of think of these new ideas that you sort of come up with?
So I think most of our new ideas we get from working with the portfolio and with the community, and so I'm lucky to be in this incredibly privileged space at Paradigm where we get to work with a lot of really cool companies, including Uniswap, including Blur, and many others, and see basically the deep research problems that they're working on that are actually important to them. And that I think keeps us fairly, there's a temptation as a researcher to kind of spin off into theory land, and the very hands-on applied context that we get from working with projects like Uniswap and just seeing oh, this is what's actually important to you, not so and so other thing, is I think just really useful for keeping our research interesting. And I think it just is a constant source of interesting problems work on. And right now, I think there's no shortage of those. And I think the other place is just from my coworkers, and often they, I have a great team at Paradigm. I think they basically, yeah, I mean, get some of the same inputs from the portfolio and from others, but also just like all sorts of amazing stuff that they're bringing to the table individually. And I think, yeah, like just bouncing ideas off of them. Yeah. And, and I think like all the researchers in the portfolio as well, including you guys. It's just like, you basically can only do good research. I think collectively it's a collective verb. And I think it's great that we have this DeFi research scene where I think there's a lot of stuff has really interesting stuff. Questions have come up and interesting answers have been posed.
I agree. It's always fun sort of working with people and chatting with them. Yeah, I think we'll sort of probably end it here. So we want to thank Dan again. If you don't follow Dan on Twitter, I'd be surprised if you were here and didn't follow Dan on Twitter. But if you don't, go follow him. And then we will be back in 2 weeks with the research podcast. So let us know if you have any guests that you're interested in. We'll probably announce it beforehand who we're coming out with. So thanks, Dan, for coming on. And that was Shin and I on this episode of the research podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. Thanks,
All
Dan.
right. Bye. Bye.